right. This will be the last lecture in the memory section of this course, and so what I hope to do is kind of tie things together a little bit, or at least once again put an exclamation mark on that notion that there really isn't a thing called memory. There's multiple memory systems, but I want to make that point now and kind of come all the way back to the first lecture this week, but make it in the context again of the amnesias. So let's do that. Week 5, Lecture 8. So I've entitled this one, What is Not Forgotten? Because what I really want to highlight is that when we say that amnesics have lost their memory, what we're really talking about is their episodic memory, if we kind of go back to Lecture 1. So they're not remembering events or people from their life. But they haven't lost their semantic memory. They still know what 7 times 6 is. They still know what capitals of places are. And interestingly, they haven't lost other kinds of memory or the ability to still learn certain kinds of things. That's the story for today. So I want to begin by a kind of famous study from a guy named Edward Claparède. Claparède was a medical doctor. He worked in a ward that included amnesic patients. And the famous story is that Claparède would greet his patients in the hallways, extend his hand, and one patient in particular, he would shake her hand and he would say, "Hello, we met yesterday, do you remember me?" And this patient had anterograde amnesia, so she wasn't able to form new memories. So she said, "No, I do not." And he said, "Oh, well, my name's Edward Claparède. When I meet you tomorrow, I will ask you my name." And he did that a few days in a row, and she could never remember his name, which is, of course, what he expected. But then he did something a little sneaky. He hid within his hand a little pin, just enough to give her a little bit of pinprick when she shook his hand. And so the first day after he did this, he went up and saw her, put out his hand, said, "Hi, nice to see you." She shook his hand and got the pinprick and pulled her hand back. He did this a few days in a row, but it didn't take long at all. Depending on what you read, some people claim it only took once, others said it took a few times, but before long, at least, she refused to shake his hand. He would reach out his hand and say, "Hello, nice to meet you," and she would say, "Hi, nice to see you too," but she would not return the handshake. And when he said, "Why will you not shake my hand?" she'd say things like, "Well, sometimes people hide things in their hand." And he said, "Well, have I ever done that to you?" And she would say, "Well, no." But of course she didn't even remember him. But she said, no, I'm not saying that you're doing that. It's just sometimes people do that. Okay, so the point of the Claparède story is that even though this woman could not remember his name or any new information from one day to the next, she was still learning something. It's not as though her memory, or at least her total memory, was gone. There were things that she was learning and that she was remembering, even if she didn't remember learning. Let's take this a step further. There's a lot of people who've done these sorts of studies with amnesics. So if we go back to our memory system, some people talk about memory in these terms. This is one of the problems, I guess you'd call it, with the memory literature, is that there are sometimes different terminologies that represent similar things. So some people talk about declarative or explicit versus non-declarative or implicit memory. And for declarative, they say it's our memory of facts and events. Well, this is sort of what we call semantic memory. This is sort of what we call episodic memory. And we know, by the way, that there's a part of the brain called the medial temporal lobe, and especially the diencephalon there, that is responsible for a lot of these, in the sense that if we have damage in this area, we have damage retrieving facts and events. Declarative, it's given that term because these are the memories that people know they have. They can declare, "I remember what I had for supper last night," or "I know what the capital of Germany is." These are things they can declare. But then the claim is there's this other non-declarative thing. There are experiences we have that affect us and change the way we behave in the future, therefore they are memory, but there are ones that we don't kind of notice. So things like skills and habits. If we engage in some task over and over and over again, we almost always get better at it. So we're getting better as a result of previous experience. That's a memory. And we know that the striatum, a part of the brain called the striatum, is what's often underlying this sort of learning. There's things called priming. Remember I told you that if you go into a hospital, your mind is particularly ready to hear or see hospital-related items. Well, that kind of memory, and it is memory because we've learned in the past, hey, when I'm in these hospital things, these are the things I see. And so that past learning now makes us expect to see those things in the future. And we know the neocortex is a big part of that sort of thing. But again, this is non-declarative. People are in the hospital and they just expect to see certain things, and they're just more readily able to perceive them. But they're not thinking they're having a memory. That's the difference. They wouldn't describe this as memory, but it certainly is the past experiencing the present. All of this sort of classical conditioning stuff we talked about. Associations that are formed. A car with a beautiful model and you start to lust after the car. That's something when you see the car again, it's not like you remember the beautiful model and then you go, oh yeah, I like that car because it was associated with the beautiful model. You like the car. Okay, that association is something, again, that's what we call non-declarative. In different parts of the brain, when it's emotional associations, we know the amygdala is strongly involved. Skeletal responses, these are much more basic, lower level associations, we know that the cerebellum's involved. And then there's also what's called non-associative learning. We're not going to talk about that too much. We're not going to worry. In fact, what I want to worry about mostly is this over here, the skills and habits, because that's what's been studied the most with amnesic patients. And in fact, they do experiments like the following. This is what's called a mirror drawing task. So this is a star, and it's really two stars, right? One within another. So it leaves a sort of gap around the side. And the task you can give people to do, anybody, is to take a pencil and draw inside this star. Well, that's easy enough, right? I'm not doing a horrible job with my mouse right here. But we add a twist. The person is sitting up here, and we put a piece of cardboard so that they can't directly see the star. But this is a mirror. So what they can see is the reflection. So they can see their hand in the mirror and they can see the star. But the trick is every motion that they see is reversed in the mirror. So when you try this, it's extremely hard. When you're drawing, we use that visual stimulation to guide our hands. And now all the visual stimulation is reversed. And so it makes us want to do the opposite. We have to learn we have to kind of remap vision onto drawing. And so if you give this to a normal person, at first you'll see a lot of mess in their drawing. They'll keep going outside the lines. But trial after trial after trial, they start to learn how to remap that visual input, and they get better and better. That's the skills and habits. Okay? Now, you can give an amnesic this task, like HM, let's say, somebody with anterior grade amnesia who cannot lay down any new memories, at least that's what we said, but we really meant this kind of memory, declarative. It turns out they can get better at things like this line drawing. In fact, they can do it almost as well, and sometimes even a little better, than a non-amnesic patient. So they're not impaired at all at learning how to do this artificial task we created. Now, of course, if we bring them in day after day and do this, each time we bring them in, we will say, do you remember this task? And they'll say, no, I don't have any memory of ever doing this. And then we'll say, okay, we'll give it a try. And it turns out they'll be pretty good. So they're gaining proficiency without any memory of the experience. That really shows these different kinds of memory. And in fact, this kind of memory is what I originally called procedural memory. Let's get to that. So procedural memory, if we think of this thing, see now they've even separated declarative and episodic. So different ways of thinking about this separate these memory systems different ways. But in declarative, in this diagram, they say declarative is I know that. That's kind of semantic memory, right? The facts that you know. Episodic, I remember when. So that's much more that event memory. Again, some people would call this declarative as well. I would. But this is procedural. I know how for example, to pronounce and comprehend new vocabulary. I know how to tie my shoes. I know how to play piano. Think of Clive Waring. Let me bring that back. Clive lost all of this, and he lost all of this, but he still had this. This procedural memory is very strong. It's the kind of memory that underlies our ability to do things, and we learn it through repetition. And it seems like the mechanism that we use to do that is different than the mechanism we use to do these kinds of memory. Because even when this is broken, this still is working fine. In fact, in one study, they even taught amnesics how to program computers. They could learn quicker and quicker, so they would be asked to create a program each day, the same program. They would never remember having done this before, but every day we brought them in, they caught on faster and faster and faster. So they were learning something. There's a procedural element to programming, and they were learning that. Okay, so I think what the amnesics provide is a really powerful example of that notion that memory is not a singular noun. It's an active processes, and there's a number of them, and they do different things, and they're responsible for different abilities. And that's why there's really so much to talk about in a memory course or a section of a course on memory. That's why I had such a challenge trying to figure out which things to tell you about, and there's so much I haven't told you about, but that's just how it is. All right, so rounding out our week on memory then, got a few videos for you. This one's Larry Squire. He does a lot of work with amnesic patients, and he's going to talk about memory, procedural memory a little bit too, so you can hear a little bit from someone who has direct experience with them. This is an interesting thing. I think at the end, my notion for the last week of this course is that we're going to do a bunch of interesting topics. I'm just going to pick a bunch of things from psychology that we haven't talked about yet and give you just bang, 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 interesting thing after interesting thing. One of them will be sleep. We'll talk about sleep. So this is kind of a prelude to that. This is a video talking about the relationship between sleep and procedural memory, and it turns out that dreaming may be very important for helping us learn these procedural memory tasks. So check that out. Now there's a couple of self-promotion things here. This one is me giving a talk on memory, and it's a talk I gave here at University of Toronto Scarborough, and I've thrown in a link to it because it's me talking about memory in a very different way than I have in this lecture series, but I think it'll connect up quite well. So it's a nice way for you to see, hear about the same kinds of things, but from a different angle. So check that out if you're interested, and you get to see me actually walk around instead of sitting down in this one. Finally, the readings over here. There's a paper, open access paper about Edouard Clapeyret. It's not so much about the amnesia stuff that I started off here. It's more about his views on education, but it'll give you a sense of who Clapeyret was and what his passions were. And a lot of when I read this, I thought, how does this fit with the MOOC world? What would Clapeyret think of a MOOC? So that's a fun thing for you. And finally, this is a true, utter, shameless plug. I admit it. I did a course with a company called The Great Courses in the States. It's 24 lectures on just memory alone. I include this partly to show you that I could have this whole course is 16 hours on intro psych. That whole course was 12 hours on just memory. So that's how much there is to talk about in memory. If you've got really deep pockets and you're really interested in memory, go ahead and purchase my course. But that's not really why I have it there. I have it there just to kind of show you and give you a sense of how much there is to talk about in the memory world. It's a fascinating world and one that I'm deeply involved in. Alrighty, so from here we're going to go on next week and talk about social psychology, and I guarantee you fascinating study after fascinating study. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Have a good one.